Some defences which consist of rock, as rock can apparently withstand the wind and the waves. But for some properties, those defences have come too late. And as we've seen on the television, some tearful residents standing there watching their homes being pulled down, we've perhaps thought to ourselves, I'll need to remember not to buy or build a house on the sand. That is not rocket science. That is not new advice. We've known that for centuries, that it's much better to have your house on rock rather than sand. 2,000 years ago, and Jesus was making the very same point in his famous Sermon on the Mount. And as he does so, we see a number of things. The first being in verse 24, and there we see the wise response to Jesus' sermon. The wise response to Jesus' sermon. Now, as Jesus brings his sermon to a close, he presents us with a series of 3 choices which we have to make in life. 3 choices which we have to make as we come to the close of his sermon. In verses 13 and 14, there was a choice of 2 roads, a broad road and a narrow road. In verses 15 to 23, we were presented with a choice of 2 influences, the influence of false teachers or the influence of the true teacher. That teacher being Jesus himself, as he has taught us during the course of this sermon. And now that we have reached verse 24, we are presented with his third and final choice. And that is a choice about what kind of person we want to be. A wise person or a foolish person. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Some of us probably remember singing a song in Sunday school that was based on these verses. The wise man built his house upon the rock. I won't go into it all today, but you know the one I'm talking about. Some of you, I'm sure, remember it. It was a great song with some great actions, and as kids we loved singing it. And it certainly helped us to remember this illustration that Jesus uses here. But although it helped us to remember his illustration, did it help us to understand the point that Jesus was making here? The chorus of that little song was, "So build your life on the Lord Jesus Christ." In and of itself, that is good advice to give to anyone, and certainly to youngsters. But the point that Jesus was making when he told that illustration was much more specific than that. As Jesus came to the end of his sermon, he didn't just say in some vague general terms, "Now listen, folk, everyone who builds their life on me is like a wise man." That is not what Jesus said. Jesus was much more pointed and much more precise than that. What Jesus said was, verse 24, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." And what words of his was he referring to when he said that? Well, he's referring to the words that he's just spoken in the previous 3 chapters, is he not? He's referring to the sermon he's just preached. He's referring to his Sermon on the Mount. And as he draws this sermon of his to a close, he raises the stakes by making it clear what kind of response he's looking for. Please not. Jesus is not merely looking for a loud amen from the audience as his sermon comes to an end. And Jesus is not merely looking for his hearers to thank him for a good word as they leave the premises. And what is perhaps most surprising of all is that Jesus is not merely looking for people who have listened attentively throughout the course of his sermon. You know, as preachers today, we are often concerned and sometimes paranoid about getting people's attention and retaining people's attention, and understandably so, because there's not much point in preaching if nobody's actually listening to us, is there? Jesus, it seems, didn't have that problem. Verse 28 tells us that the crowds were amazed at his teaching. But what is interesting is that Jesus wasn't looking for people who had merely listened to him. Jesus wasn't looking for people who were merely amazed by him. No, Jesus was looking for something much bigger and greater and more demanding than that. Jesus was looking for people who would obey him. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. That is what Jesus is looking for. People who will hear his sermon and put it into practice. And what he was looking for in response to his sermon back then, 2,000 years ago, when he first preached it, is what he, as the risen Christ, is still looking for in response to his sermon today. And that is obedience. Obedience. Or as James would express it some years later, he's looking not merely for listeners to his word, he's looking for doers of his word. Everyone who hears these words of mine, I'm sorry I've repeated this is about my fourth time, but I'm repeating it deliberately. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. That is the wise response to Jesus' sermon. You walk past a building site and you see excavators removing lorry loads of soil. You see diggers frantically digging down. You hear machines drilling down, all the way down until they hit the rock. And what do you think to yourself? Do you think, silly clowns, what a waste of time. What a waste of effort. No, that's not what you think. If recent events in Turkey and if recent events in Norfolk ought to have taught us anything, you ought to be thinking to yourself as you walk past that building site, good idea. That's a wise move, mate. That's a wise thing to do. And likewise, says Jesus, as he comes to the close of his sermon, there is a wise move to make as we reach the close of this sermon. There is a wise thing to do in response to my sermon, says Jesus, and that is to put it into practice. It was a sermon, you may remember, that began way back in chapter 5, verse 3, with these words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." It was a sermon that taught us to pray to God in chapter 6, verse 12, with these words, "Forgive us our debts." It was a sermon that taught us in chapter 7, verse 7, to ask and to seek and to knock for the forgiveness that we so much need and continually need for all the times that we fail to live as Jesus has taught us to live. And the question we need to ask as we come to the end of his sermon is this: how have we responded to that teaching of Jesus? How have we responded to it? Have we acknowledged our poverty of spirit and our spiritual bankruptcy in the sight of a holy God? Have we come to God asking for his forgiveness for all our sins, a forgiveness that is wonderfully possible because of the substitutionary sin atoning death that this same Jesus would make his way to Jerusalem and eventually die? Have we responded to the teaching of Jesus in that way? Have we not merely heard what he has said on those matters, but actually put them into practice? If so, then that is a wise response to Jesus' sermon. But please note, as I pointed out some time ago, Jesus' sermon is not a pick and mix affair where you can take a lot of this, a little of that, and none of that. No, the entire sermon is to be believed. The entire sermon is to be put into practice in its entirety. And therefore, if we have acknowledged that poverty of spirit and known that forgiveness that Jesus has spoken about, then we also need to ask what our response to the rest of the sermon has been. You can't just take the bits of it that you like. Are we putting into practice what Jesus has taught us on moral and marital and monetary matters? Or if you would find 2 S's better to remember than 3 M's, are we putting into practice what Jesus has taught us on sex and savings? Are we putting into practice what Jesus has said in his exposure of our religious hypocrisy and our super spiritual judgmentalism? Having heard him speak on such matters, what is our response? Is it merely one of hearing? Or is it one of hearing and obeying? Don't forget, it's obedience that Jesus is looking for. It's obedience that Jesus is preaching for. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man. That is the wise response to Jesus' sermon. Secondly, skipping a couple of verses to verse 26, and there we see the foolish response to Jesus' sermon. The foolish response to Jesus' sermon. Now, in sharp contrast to what Jesus has said about a wise response, Jesus now turns his attention in verse 26 to a foolish response, and here is what it looks like. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Now, please note, the people that Jesus is referring to here in verse 26 are not the obvious enemies of Jesus that we read about in other parts of the gospel. It's not the atheists or the agnostics or even the Pharisees that he's speaking about in verse 26. Instead, it is people who have heard his words. In other words, it is people who have just sat through his Sermon on the Mount. They were in church that day. And what is even more frightening is that it was possibly even people who had enjoyed his Sermon on the Mount. And why do I say that? Well, although the opening verses of chapter 5 suggest that it was his disciples that were present when Jesus began this sermon, the closing verses of chapter 7 suggest that there is a much bigger audience by the time the sermon comes to an end. Verse 28 speaks about the crowds. And what it says about the crowds is that they were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. In other words, his teaching was like a breath of fresh air to the crowds because It was wonderful compared with the religious and moral and boring teaching that they were used to hearing. But what is interesting is that although Matthew tells us of their amazement at Jesus' sermon, he stops short of telling us of their obedience to Jesus' sermon. Yes, although there may very well have been some who heard what Jesus had to say, were amazed at what Jesus had to say, and subsequently responded to what Jesus had to say in faith and obedience, although there may have been some like that, there may very well have been others who merely heard and were impressed, were amazed, but that was as far as it went. And it is concerning such people who have sat through his sermon, people who have heard his words. It is concerning such people that Jesus says in verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. During the Easter holidays that are coming up, you take a walk along Newborough Beach, and as you get to the far end of the beach, you come across a pile of house bricks, a bag of cement, and a cement mixer. And while you're looking at them, a young couple appear with their overalls on and with trowels in their hand. You ask them what they're doing, and they tell you, well, we've just got married. It so happened, in fact, that we were married in Ebenezer Evangelical Church in Bangor. No, it wasn't Hanny on Angharad. Don't worry. We got married in Ebenezer in Bangor, but the thought of living in a big city like Bangor just did not appeal to us. And so we thought we would set up home here on the beach. After all, what better place to start married life than to look out to the Irish Sea morning, afternoon and evening. Even the most expensive houses in Bangor don't have a view anywhere near as good as that, they tell you. It's a no-brainer. And in response you politely say, congratulations on getting married, and the best of luck with your building project, because you'll need it. And as you walk away, you are thinking to yourself, how silly, how stupid, how naive, how foolish can you possibly be building a house here on the sand? And yet, says Jesus in verse 26, although you may not be as naive as to build a house on Newborough Beach, you may be demonstrating a similar foolishness by merely listening to my sermon, but not putting it into practice. And so that being the case, we need to ask ourselves the question, how have we responded to the words of Jesus during the course of this sermon? Have we responded wisely, or have we responded foolishly? For example, as you heard Jesus speak about poverty of spirit and the need of forgiveness, you may have sat there thinking to yourself, oh yes, I know some people. In fact, it's a pity they're not here this morning, because they could certainly do with having their sins forgiven, that's for sure. But as for me, well, I'm not that bad a person after all, and certainly not compared to a lot of other folks I know. And consequently, you've heard Jesus' words on forgiveness and poverty of spirit. You've heard it, but you haven't put it into practice. And as for the moral and the marital and the monetary teaching of Jesus, you've perhaps come to the conclusion that you've got too much to lose. And consequently, you'll just continue living as you're doing. Or you've heard the words of Jesus, but you haven't put them into practice. And so although we have patiently and politely sat through the Sermon on the Mount over recent weeks and months, it may be that we've heard what Jesus has had to say, and it may even be that we've possibly enjoyed what Jesus has had to say, and it may even be that we've been amazed by what Jesus had to say, but that is as far as it has gone. Jesus' famous sermon means nothing more to you than just that. A famous sermon in the history of our world, a famous sermon to be read and to be recited. But as far as you are concerned, it's not something to be obeyed. If that's your response, then please don't think that you're doing Jesus any favours by merely listening to his sermon, because that is not the purpose for which Jesus originally preached it. Jesus didn't preach this sermon merely for it to be admired. Instead, he preached it with a view to it being put into practice. He preached it with a view to it changing our lives. And if our response is anything less than that, then says Jesus in verse 26 that we're like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. That is the foolish response to Jesus' sermon. Thirdly, finally, the final outcome of our response to Jesus' sermon, verses 25 and 27, the final outcome of our response to Jesus' sermon. Now, if you're local, then you'll know that there have been some apartments built recently on Danehill Road, just down from the railway station. Living quite close to there, I was able to watch those buildings go up day by day, and what surprised me was the time that it took for any visible progress to be made. So much time seemed to be spent on the preparatory work that I began to wonder if they were ever actually going to get built. So much time was spent below ground that I began to wonder if there was ever going to be anything above ground to show for it. And that is why there is always the temptation for construction companies to skimp on the foundations. Foundations are often out of sight, and in the short term might prove to be not really necessary. For example, if a recently married couple build their house on Newborough Beach in the month of April, then they may very well have 5 or 6 months of bliss looking out to the Irish Sea. They may well do. But come a wild winter's night in December, which so happens to coincide with a high tide, then they'll discover why they needed better foundations. You see, the reason why the man who built his house on the rock in verse 24 is described as a wise man is because sooner or later there came a storm. Verse 25, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundations on the rock. It was in the storm that the man's choice of foundation proved to be a wise choice. And at the same time, it was in the storm that the man who built his house on the sand was shown up to be a foolish man. Verse 27, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Oh, in the short term, the foolish man seemed to be happily enjoying his villa by the beach. And he no doubt thought to himself, that other guy up the road who built a house around about the same time as me, why on earth did he go to all that trouble and all that expense of digging down and finding rock? What a waste of time, of effort and money, when he could have been here with a much better view. But in the long term, his folly was eventually exposed, because it was the storm that ultimately revealed the wisdom and the folly of the two builders in Jesus' story. Please note, the ultimate contrast in this little story that Jesus tells, the ultimate contrast is not between two foundations and not even between two houses. The ultimate contrast is between the two men. It's between two categories of people. That is what Jesus has drawn our attention to in verses 24 and 26. Someone who behaves like a wise man and someone who behaves like a foolish man. And when we come to the illustration, it should still be those two, the wise and the foolish. It should still be those two that are at the forefront of our minds. That is the ultimate contrast between two people, a wise one and a foolish one. And in the long term, the folly of the foolish was eventually exposed, because it was the storm that ultimately revealed the wisdom and the folly of the two builders. And what is true of the construction industry is also true of life. It will be the storm that reveals the wisdom of believing and obeying the teaching of Jesus, and at the same time it will be the storm that reveals the folly of rejecting or ignoring the teaching of Jesus. It will be a future time of testing that reveals the wisdom and the folly of both. And what future time of testing could Jesus possibly have in mind? Well, if you look carefully at verse 24, you'll see that this little section begins with the word therefore, which would suggest that there is a connection between this verse and what Jesus has just said. And if you glance back to the previous verses, verses 21 to 23, you'll see that Jesus highlights in those verses the danger of people making claims that were empty claims, false claims, futile claims, claims to know Jesus and claims to have done remarkable things for Jesus. But, says Jesus, such claims cannot always be taken at face value. For example, verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. In other words, says Jesus, it's not enough to say that you know God. You need to demonstrate a desire to obey him. It's not enough to profess Jesus as Lord. Yes, to be a Christian, you must profess Jesus as Lord. But if that profession is true, if that profession is sincere, if that profession is genuine, then it will be demonstrated by a desire to obey him. Is that not what Jesus said a little later to his disciples? He says, look, if you love me, it will reveal itself by the fact that you obey my commandments. The contrast in those previous verses was between merely saying and actually doing. Whereas the contrast now in verses 24 and 27 is between merely hearing and actually doing. But whether it is merely saying or merely hearing, the warning of these verses is that merely saying or merely hearing is not sufficient. What Jesus is looking for, both now and what he'll be looking for on that future day, is people whose claim to know him as Lord is actually being backed up by a desire to obey him. There is such people, says Jesus in verses 21 to 23, who will be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven on that future day. You see, as in the previous two choices that Jesus has presented us with, the two roads, the broad and the narrow road, and the influence of the false teachers and so on, as in the previous two choices that Jesus has presented us with, we have been encouraged to take the long view once again. The long view. We have been encouraged to consider final outcomes. Because although we may experience storms of various kinds during the course of this life, the ultimate storm that we will face, the ultimate test that we will face, is the storm of eternity, when we will all have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ to receive what is due to us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. And it is on that future occasion that the wisdom or the folly of our response to Jesus' words will be fully and finally revealed. If we have heard the teaching of Jesus, but have chose to ignore it or reject it, then we will be barred from the kingdom of heaven on that future day, for the simple reason, verse 21, not everyone who says to Jesus, Lord, Lord, will enter his kingdom, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And that is why, says Jesus in verse 24, it is the person who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice who is the wise man, because it is he who is doing the will of my Father in heaven. It is that person who's built with the long term in view. It is they who have listened and have responded to my words in the light of a coming eternity. It is they who have heard my words and responded to them in the light of a coming judgment. A coming judgment when the wisdom or the folly of our response to the teaching of Jesus will be fully and finally revealed. That is the final outcome. Please note the story about the wise and the foolish builders. For a long time, they might appear to be getting on fine. But it was the long term that proved that the one was wise and the other is foolish. And so it is with the teaching of Jesus. You might think, what's the point in restricting my lifestyle and submitting to the authority of his teaching when I could be having a whale of a time with everyone else in the world? Yes, in the short term, that might be true. But as Jesus has brought his sermon to a close, he's encouraged us again and again and again not to think short term, not to think immediate present, to think long term. Take the long view and consider the final outcome of hearing and obeying the teaching of Jesus, in contrast to hearing but not obeying it. There is the long term that will reveal the final outcome to our response to Jesus' sermon. And so that being the case, let us make sure that our response to Jesus' sermon is the wise one. The response that not only hears it, but actually puts it into practice. Three things we see as Jesus' sermon comes to a close. Firstly, we see the wise response to Jesus' sermon. Then we see the foolish response to Jesus' sermon. And thirdly, the final outcome of our response to Jesus' sermon.